It was early fall in the Adirondacks, 2016. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. It had been one of those things I'd wanted to do for years, just to get away from the city, away from the noise. It was supposed to be a solo trip, just me and the forest. A few days of quiet and solitude to clear my head. I'd packed my backpack with all the essentials. A small tent, sleeping bag, food for a few days, my trusty flashlight, and a couple of tools in case something went wrong. I arrived at the trailhead around mid-afternoon, with the sun still high enough to make the forest feel alive with warmth, but not too hot. The air had that crisp fall edge to it, the kind of coolness that made you want to zip up your jacket, but not so cold that it made you uncomfortable. The ground was still a little muddy from recent rain, and the trees seemed to be in that perfect transition between late summer and fall. Lush greens starting to tinge with yellow and orange. I wasn't exactly new to camping, but I'd never done much by myself. I'd gone with friends in the past, but this time it was just me. There was something peaceful about it, something reassuring about knowing that no one else would interrupt the sounds of the leaves rustling and the birds overhead. I made my way up the trail, the soft crunch of dirt and leaves beneath my boots the only sound as I hiked deeper into the woods. I'd been walking for about 2 hours when I decided to set up camp. The trail was quiet, save for the occasional rustling in the underbrush, but nothing unusual. I found a clearing with a small stream running through it. The spot seemed perfect, plenty of flat ground for my tent and a good water source. It was a little more remote than I had expected, but that was fine. I liked the idea of being far from anyone. I felt like I could breathe here, away from the stress of life. After setting up my tent, I took a moment to look around. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was growing cooler, and the forest was beginning to settle into a different rhythm. I unpacked my small camp stove and made myself some simple soup for dinner. It was just the kind of quiet I had hoped for, peaceful and serene. As the night deepened, I sat by the fire, the crackling of the wood breaking the silence. The firelight flickered in the dark, casting eerie shadows around me. The temperature had dropped enough that I zipped up my jacket. I kept the fire small, not wanting to burn through my wood too quickly, but it was enough to keep the chill at bay. I had brought a book, but I wasn't in the mood to read. Instead, I just listened to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. I didn't realize how tired I was until I started to nod off next to the fire. The warmth from the flames was lulling me into a drowsy haze, and I knew I needed to get some sleep if I was going to hike the next day. So I extinguished the fire, making sure the embers were completely out, and crawled into my tent. The first few hours of sleep were uneventful. The wind outside rustled the leaves in the trees, and the occasional snap of a branch kept me from fully relaxing, but nothing too unsettling. That was until I woke up in the middle of the night. It was just past midnight, the forest dead silent. I woke with a start, heart pounding, though I couldn't figure out why. It was like something had stirred me from sleep, but there was no obvious reason. I lay there in the dark, listening, trying to place the sound that had woken me. First, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, there was the sound of something moving in the distance. The kind of sound you might hear if someone was walking through the underbrush. Branches snapping and leaves rustling. But what unsettled me was how soft and slow the movement was, almost deliberate. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another hiker? A bear? A deer? Maybe it was nothing. But then again, it didn't feel like nothing. I waited, straining my ears, trying to listen for any other sounds. The forest was unnervingly still, save for the strange, careful movement somewhere beyond my tent. It was coming from the left, just past the small stream. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I wasn't alone. The sound stopped abruptly. Absolute silence. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't know what it was, but I felt an undeniable sense of unease. My flashlight was just a few feet away in my backpack, but I didn't dare move to grab it. What if whatever it was heard me? I held my breath, trying to focus on any sounds, anything that might give me an idea of what was happening. But all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. The wind had stopped.
No auschutiv.
No distant rustle of animals moving in the underbrush, just that strange, empty silence. Then, suddenly, I heard something else. Faint, slow creaking sound, like something heavy was moving through the trees. Couldn't place it, but it wasn't natural. It didn't sound like the typical noises animals make when they're navigating through the woods. It wasn't a bear or a deer or anything I could recognize. The sound was too methodical, too deliberate. I held still, eyes wide in the dark, waiting for something to happen. The tent felt like it was closing in on me, its fabric a barrier between me and whatever was out there. The sound continued, moving closer now, the subtle creak of branches and the shifting of the underbrush. It was as if someone or something was moving with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. I tried to shake off the rising panic. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was a person, but I'd just gotten too worked up. But the more I thought about it, the more the sound seemed wrong. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't acting like an animal. It wasn't rushing or scurrying. It was just moving. And then I heard a voice, but not in the way you might expect. It wasn't clear or loud. It was a whisper, barely audible, and it came from somewhere outside my tent. The words didn't make sense. I couldn't hear them clearly enough to understand, but it was the tone that struck me. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't comforting. It was cold, distant, the kind of voice that makes your skin crawl. I stayed frozen, holding my breath. My mind raced, and I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just someone else camping nearby. But then I remembered the trail had been empty when I set up. There hadn't been anyone else for miles. The closest trailhead was over 5 miles away, and no one else had been there when I arrived. I realized that I was completely alone. A new sound cut through the silence. A heavy, uneven footstep, followed by another, closer now. I could hear it. Something walking toward my tent, slow and deliberate. My pulse quickened, and my throat went dry. I wanted to grab my flashlight, but my arms felt too heavy to move. I didn't dare make a sound, but I could feel the tension in the air, the sense of something dangerous, something waiting. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing now, slow, deep breaths that seemed too deliberate, too controlled. I held my own breath, the air in my lungs tight as I waited for whatever was out there to make its next move. The sound of the breathing grew louder, and I could swear I felt something watching me. Suddenly, the moment shattered. A loud crack, like a branch snapping underfoot, echoed through the silence. The breathing stopped. The footsteps started again, this time moving away, retreating into the woods. I lay there in the dark, my heart still racing, listening to the sounds of the forest slowly return to normal. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I kept waiting for something else to happen, but it didn't. The movement, the breathing, the strange whispering. It had all stopped as quickly as it had started. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just some kind of twisted prank or someone messing with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse. Something that had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to make its move. By the time dawn finally broke, the sky lightening with the first rays of sun, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I didn't want to stick around to find out if whatever had been out there was still watching me. I didn't take the time to eat breakfast or linger by the stream. I just grabbed my gear and hiked back to the trailhead. The woods were quiet now, too quiet. The peace I had come here to find had been shattered, and I knew that I would never look at the forest the same way again. Something had been out there, and I wasn't sure what, but I was certain that whatever it wasn't finished. I made my way back to civilization, the sound of my boots on the trail the only company I had. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I went on that trip in the summer of 2014. I was 29 years old at the time, and I remember because I had just left my job at a construction supply company in Salt Lake City. I had saved up a little money, and I didn't have anyone depending on me. No girlfriend, no kids. So I decided to take a few weeks and just go camping. I had this idea that I'd drive around Utah and parts of Arizona, hike a little, sleep under the stars, clear my head. Just me, a tent, and whatever I could fit in the back of my SUV. I'd done a lot of camping before. I was always into it growing up. My dad was the type who didn't believe in hotels. Even when we'd visit family in other states, he'd park us in some national forest or BLM land for a few nights and pitch a tent instead of booking a motel. He said it was freeing. As a kid, I didn't always get it, but I think I understood better as I got older. There's something about being alone out in the open, away from phones and people and engines and streetlights. It's not peace exactly. It's more like stillness, a sort of hollow quiet that you can only get in places where no one else is. I liked that. I wanted it. I planned to camp in a mix of places, some legit campgrounds, some off-grid spots. I had my own water jugs, food, propane, first aid kit, and a solid 2-person tent. I wasn't dumb about it. I knew how fast things could go south in the desert. I kept paper maps with me in case I lost cell service, which happened often. I also brought a Ruger .357 revolver with me, mostly for peace of mind. I didn't plan on using it unless I had to. About a week into the trip, after camping a few nights in Zion and a couple around Kanab, I decided to drive deeper into Navajo Nation land. I'd always been interested in the canyons down there, those massive desert plateaus where red cliffs meet empty sky. A local I'd met earlier that week pointed me toward an old logging road that ran up into a less traveled area northeast of Kayenta, Arizona. The road was marked on my map, but barely. It didn't even have a name. He told me it was public land, technically, and that I'd probably have the whole place to myself. I liked that idea. The turnoff was easy to miss. There was no sign, just a gravel path cutting between 2 scrubby hills. The road was rough, but my SUV could handle it. I drove maybe 30 minutes up that path until I reached a kind of basin. Flat, wide-open desert, rimmed with cliffs on all sides. There were juniper trees and brush here and there, but not much else. No tire tracks, no other people. I couldn't even hear planes overhead. Just wind and the occasional bird call. Felt perfect. I parked beside a tall juniper and walked a little ways out to find a spot for my tent. I picked a slight rise near some boulders, so I'd be able to see in all directions. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going with dry wood I'd brought. I heated up a can of chili and ate it while watching the sun go down behind the cliffs. Everything turned orange and gold and then slowly faded to a deep purple. That first night was calm, quiet. I remember how bright the stars were. No clouds, no moon, just a sky full of white. It was beautiful. I fell asleep without trouble. The next morning, I hiked out a few miles to explore. The land was rough and uneven. Dry creek beds, loose rock, patches of scrub. I didn't go too far, maybe 4 or 5 miles out and then back. I didn't see anyone, and I didn't expect to. This wasn't the kind of place people just stumbled into. When I got back to camp, I was dusty, a little sunburned, and ready to rest. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, and dozed off in the shade near my tent. It was late afternoon when I first noticed something strange. I'd just woken up from my nap and was sitting with my back against a rock, looking out across the basin. The air was still, and the heat shimmered along the horizon. That's when I saw movement. First, I thought it was just an animal. Coyote, maybe. It was far off, probably half a mile away, and low to the ground. But the way it moved didn't sit right with me. It wasn't a clean, smooth run like a dog or a deer. It was jerky, unnatural. It stopped and started. Sometimes it would stand still for several seconds, then dart forward, then drop back down. I watched it for maybe a minute, trying to make sense of it. I wasn't scared, just curious. But something about the way it kept its distance, staying just close enough to be seen, bothered me. I went back to my tent and got my binoculars. When I looked through them, I couldn't find it at first. I scanned the area where I'd seen the movement, but it was just scrub and sand. Then, as I was about to lower the binoculars, I caught a flash of motion again. This time, I saw it more clearly. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. They were crouched low, wearing what looked like dark, ragged clothes.
No pec, no gir, no visível veapon.
Just hunched there among the rocks, looking in my direction. I couldn't see their face. They didn't wave, didn't call out, just crouched. Still, I lowered the binoculars and stood there for a while, watching. I didn't move. Neither did they. Eventually, I turned back to my camp. I tried to shake it off. I figured maybe it was a hiker who'd gotten lost. Or a local. Maybe they were just out scouting for something. I didn't know. But I didn't like how they didn't try to approach or make contact. That was what kept bothering me. That night, I didn't sleep as easily. I kept the fire going longer than usual. I kept the gun closer to my sleeping bag. The stars were still there, but they didn't comfort me like before. I kept thinking about that crouched figure. What were they doing out here? Why hadn't they come closer? Sometime around midnight, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a crunch, like a footstep on gravel. Close. I sat up fast, heart pounding. I didn't call out. There was no one to call to. I just listened. Another step, then nothing. I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked out. The fire had died down to embers, so I couldn't see much. Just shadows, the outline of the rocks, the dark trees. I scanned the area for movement but didn't see any. Then I noticed something near the edge of my camp. It looked like a shape, a silhouette, too still, too upright. It wasn't moving, but it hadn't been there before. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it toward the shape. Nothing was there, just open desert. No figure, no animal, nothing. I scanned the whole area with the light, sweeping it back and forth. Still nothing. I stepped out of the tent slowly, gun in one hand, flashlight in the other. I walked a short circle around the camp, shining the light into the dark. I didn't see or hear anything else, but I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided I was done with that spot. I packed up everything quickly, stuffed the sleeping bag, rolled the tent, tossed my gear into the SUV. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to leave. But as I walked back toward the rocks where I'd first seen the figure, I noticed something on the ground. Tracks, bare footprints. Human. Deep ones too, like whoever made them was heavy or walking with force. They led from the far side of the rocks directly toward my camp. Then they circled it. Then they stopped. No prints led away. That shook me. I drove fast back down that logging road. Dust flew behind me. I didn't slow until I was on the highway again. I didn't stop until I hit Page, Arizona, a few hours later. I checked into a cheap motel and locked the door behind me. That night, I barely slept again. Not because I was scared of someone breaking in. I was just thinking, running it all through my head. The figure, the crouching, the footprints, the movement in the night. Felt like something had been watching me, playing with me. The next day, I drove back toward Utah. I cut the trip short and went home. For weeks after that, I kept thinking about it. I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone out there had gotten lost or was living rough off-grid. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. But I kept coming back to those footprints. How they circled the camp. How they ended at nothing. And I remembered the way that figure moved, jerky, crouching, almost like they weren't used to their own body. Like they were imitating something. Pretending. The locals down there talk about skinwalkers. Not in a fairy tale kind of way, but like real things to avoid. Things that wear other people's skin. Things that copy. I don't believe in that kind of stuff. I never have. But I also don't think I'll ever camp alone in that part of the desert again. It was late September when I decided to go camping in the mountains of Wyoming. I had been thinking about it for months, needing to get away from the rush of city life and spend some time alone in nature. No distractions, no people, just me and the wilderness. I didn't want anything fancy. I wasn't one for glamping or fancy campgrounds, so I chose a more remote spot in the Shoshone National Forest, somewhere a bit off the beaten path. I arrived at the trailhead at around noon, the sun already dipping low behind the peaks. I'd seen the weather forecast, and it was supposed to be clear skies for the next couple of days. But you never know in the mountains. The air felt cool and crisp, with just a hint of autumn, a reminder that winter was on its way. The trail wasn't anything too difficult, maybe 5 miles in total, but the first mile was steep. I wasn't carrying too much gear, just the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, food for a few days, a flashlight, and my rifle. I wasn't hunting, but I always carried it with me for peace of mind. There had been rumors of wolves in the area, and though I wasn't particularly worried, it was better to be prepared. The forest was quiet as I made my way deeper into the woods. The only sounds were the rustling of the wind in the trees and the crunch of my boots on the dry ground. The further I went, the more isolated it felt, the air growing even cooler, the shadows lengthening as the afternoon sun continued to dip. Eventually, I found a small clearing beside a bubbling creek and decided this would be as good a spot as any to set up camp. It wasn't long before I had my tent pitched and my campfire going. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and the smell of wood smoke filled the air. I sat down, propping myself up against a rock, and just stared into the flames. I didn't need to do anything.
No deadlines, no obligations.
Felt good to be away from it all. As evening came, I started to get the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't anything overt, more like a sense that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just nerves. I'd camped alone plenty of times before, but there was something about this place that felt different. The forest around me seemed denser, the trees taller, their dark trunks twisting in strange ways, their branches moving eerily in the wind. I shrugged it off and focused on cooking my dinner. The sun finally set, leaving the sky painted in streaks of orange and purple. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the ground. I ate quickly, not particularly hungry, but not wanting to waste time either. Afterward, I cleaned up, made sure the fire was contained, and sat back down to relax. The sky had turned dark, the stars now sparkling overhead like diamonds scattered across velvet. I tried to read a book I'd brought, but my eyes kept wandering toward the trees. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger now. I shook my head, telling myself I was just paranoid. It wasn't anything. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the silence almost suffocating. The only sounds now were the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a coyote. I kept my rifle close by just in case. It was foolish, I knew that, but it was a comfort. I finally decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, trying to push the creeping anxiety out of my mind. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. It wasn't until well past midnight that I finally drifted off, though my dreams were restless, filled with dark shapes and the distant echo of footsteps. I woke to the sound of something moving outside my tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but as the noise continued, I began to wonder if it was something more. It was too deliberate, too steady, like footsteps, slow, measured, and cautious. I lay still, holding my breath, straining to hear. The sound came closer, stopping just outside my tent. I could hear the soft crunch of dirt and twigs, the low rasp of breathing. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it deafening in the stillness of the night. For a long moment, nothing moved. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to calm myself, thinking it might be some curious animal, though the thought didn't make me feel any better. I gripped my rifle, keeping it close by, but didn't move. If it was an animal, I didn't want to make any noise and startle it. Then the sound came again, a soft shuffle, like someone or something was pacing just beyond the edge of the tent. I could hear the creak of old wood, the faintest scratching sound. It wasn't an animal. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe someone was lost, but that didn't make sense. The nearest trailhead was miles away. No one else would be out here this deep in the woods, especially not in the middle of the night. I waited, my muscles tense, barely breathing. The sound continued, and I felt my stomach tighten into a knot. Whoever or whatever it was, they knew I was in the tent. I could feel it, there was no mistaking it now. The footsteps came closer, and I could hear the soft scrape of something dragging on the ground. It was almost as if they were testing the area, like they were trying to figure out where I was. My mind raced with all the possibilities, and the thought that someone could be out here watching me made my blood run cold. I told myself to stay calm, that I could handle this, but that didn't help the sick feeling in my stomach. I could hear the shuffling again, this time closer than ever. The noise stopped suddenly, and I waited, holding my breath. Then, in the eerie silence, I heard a voice. Not a voice in the traditional sense, but a low, muffled sound like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the cadence of it, as if they were muttering to themselves. I lay perfectly still, trying to make sense of what was happening. My thoughts were jumbled, and I couldn't focus. I was alone, deep in the wilderness, with no one to help me. I reached for my flashlight, slowly, careful not to make any noise. The moment my fingers brushed the flashlight, a loud snap echoed from outside. Something had stepped on a twig, and the sound made my blood freeze. I sat up quickly, shining the flashlight toward the entrance of the tent. There was no movement, no sign of anyone. I held my breath and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing moved. The forest seemed too quiet, too still. I could barely hear my own breathing, the sound of the wind in the trees almost drowned out by the tension in the air. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to think clearly. I was locked in a battle with my own mind, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But the silence was unbearable, and the weight of the darkness outside was suffocating. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I was still awake. My nerves were shot, and I could barely keep my eyes open. I hadn't slept a wink, but I had survived the night. I didn't waste any time packing up. I was too shaken to stay another moment in that spot. The forest seemed different now, less welcoming, more oppressive. I gathered my things as quickly as I could, checking the area around me for any sign of the person or animal that had been outside my tent. There was nothing. The clearing was empty, just as it had been when I first arrived. The sound of the creek running nearby was soothing, but it didn't do much to calm my frayed nerves. I moved as fast as I could, retracing my steps along the trail, keeping my senses alert for any signs of movement. I was still on edge, my mind racing with questions, but as I made my way back to the trailhead, the feeling of being watched gradually faded. By the time I reached my car, the sun was fully up, and I could finally breathe a little easier. My hands were shaking, but I wasn't about to let myself fall apart. I'd made it through the night. Whatever had happened, it hadn't come back. The woods felt peaceful again, but I knew that I wasn't going to forget that feeling of being so utterly alone. I drove home in silence, my mind still processing everything. I never found out what or who had been outside my tent. I don't think I ever will, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be returning to that spot again. Sometimes some things are better left unexplored, and whatever was out there, I was lucky it hadn't gotten any closer. I was 32 when I went on that trip. It was October 2021. I had just moved out of my apartment in Denver and was between jobs. Things had felt kind of heavy back then. Stress from work, a bad breakup, and just the dull routine of the city grinding away at me for years. I wanted some space, just a few days alone, far from traffic, phone service, and buildings. I packed up my old Jeep with some camping gear. A tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, a few freeze-dried meals, and a cooler with some water, snacks, and beer. I also brought my folding chair, an axe, a tarp, my knife, and a .38 revolver I kept in the glove box. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I figured if I ran into a bear or something, I'd want the option. I chose a place I'd found on a map months earlier, Echo Ridge, tucked about 70 miles west of Colorado Springs. It wasn't an official campground, just a loose collection of Forest Service roads and old trails from the 80s. Not many people went there anymore because of the rough terrain and how isolated it was. That's what I liked about it. I drove the whole morning and reached the edge of the ridge around noon. The Jeep made it most of the way, but I had to park when the trail narrowed and got rocky. I hiked in the last couple miles. The trees were mostly pine, tall and swaying slightly in the breeze. The air smelled like dried needles and sap. The sky was gray but not threatening. A few birds chirped lazily overhead. I followed a game trail downhill for a while and found a small clearing about 100 feet above a creek. There were signs of old fire pits and flattened grass. Someone had camped there before, but not recently. It was just big enough to set up the tent, make a fire, and still feel tucked in. The creek ran through a cut in the slope, maybe 20 feet wide, with clear water running steadily across smooth rocks. That sound alone made me want to stay. I dropped my pack and took a slow breath. No noise but the creek and the occasional rustle in the trees. I set up camp, laid out the tarp under the tent, hammered the stakes, and set a few logs in a ring for a fire later. I kept it simple, no need to overdo it. I just wanted to sit, think, maybe take a few hikes, and get my mind back to zero. That first day was peaceful. I walked the area a bit, found the edge of a hill where I could see some distant mountains, and sat there for an hour just listening. Later, I cooked one of the freeze-dried meals, beef stew, I think, and watched the sun dip low behind the trees. The whole forest glowed gold for about 10 minutes, then faded into a cool blue before it got truly dark. I built a small fire and sat with a beer, watching the flames move. There was no moon that night, just a wash of stars overhead. It was the kind of dark you feel, not just see. I could barely make out the outline of my tent a few feet away. I had my flashlight, but I didn't use it unless I had to. Something about the firelight made everything feel more real. Around 10 p.m., I turned in. The sleeping bag was warm, and the tent held out the breeze well. I fell asleep fast, lulled by the sound of water below. I woke up once in the middle of the night, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m.
No sounds.
That's what did it. It was too quiet. The creek was still there, I could hear that, but nothing else.
No wind, no bugs, no crack em branches.
Just stillness. I lay there, wide awake, listening for something, anything, but there was nothing. I thought maybe a predator was nearby and everything had gone silent because of it. I reached slowly for the flashlight and my revolver. Didn't turn either one on. I just held them and waited. After a while, I must have drifted back to sleep, because the next thing I knew it was morning. The sun came up pale and cold. I made coffee and oatmeal and tried not to think too much about the silence from the night before. Forests have rhythms. Maybe that was just one of them. The second day I explored downstream. The creek led into a small ravine, narrow and shaded. The rocks were slick, but I picked my way carefully. I found some animal prints near the water, deer mostly. Nothing fresh, though. I didn't see another person. No boot prints, no tire tracks, nothing. Just the long stretch of forest and the quiet sound of water and wind. Back at camp that afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. One of my food wrappers, the empty beef stew pouch I'd tucked into a plastic bag, was lying on the ground, a few feet from where I'd left the trash. The bag itself was still there, just lighter. At first, I figured wind, maybe a squirrel, but I'd folded the bag and tucked it under a rock. Shouldn't have moved. I looked around but saw no tracks. No claw marks, no little prints in the soft dirt. Still, I cleaned up everything tighter, made sure no scent would draw animals in. I skipped the fire that night, just ate cold food and turned in early. Something was bothering me, though I didn't know what. I woke up again that night. This time it was around midnight. Again, silence. Not even the creek. That's what chilled me. It didn't make sense. Water doesn't stop like that. I sat up, heart pounding. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make noise. Cold air rushed in. I leaned out and looked toward the creek. There was someone standing down by the water. Not an animal. Person. Still. Upright. Facing my direction. I froze. He wasn't holding a light. Just a black shape against the dim outline of the creek. Couldn't make out clothes, face, nothing. Just that outline. He didn't move. I stared for what felt like minutes. Then finally he turned. Slowly. Stepped off the rock he'd been standing on. And disappeared into the trees on the far side of the creek. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up with my flashlight and gun in hand until the sun rose. Every little sound made my chest clench. But nothing else happened. Morning came. Just a normal, cold morning in the woods. I packed up immediately. Fast. My hands were shaking. I didn't eat, didn't even drink water. Just tore down the tent, rolled it wet, and stuffed it into my pack. I kept looking toward the creek. Nothing. I took a different path back. One I hadn't used on the way in. Longer, steeper, but away from where I'd seen that figure. I didn't stop, didn't rest. Just kept walking until I reached the Jeep. When I got there, I saw something that made me feel sick. The passenger door was open. Not wide, just cracked an inch. I knew I'd locked it. Inside, the glove box was open. The revolver was gone. I stood there, staring, mouth dry. I didn't know what to do. Call the cops? Drive to the nearest town? Report what? A guy standing by a creek and a missing gun? I checked the Jeep. Nothing else was taken. Keys were still in my bag. Everything else untouched. I slammed the door, locked it, and drove like hell out of there. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station about 40 miles away. I sat in the lot for 10 minutes, just trying to calm down. I didn't call anyone, didn't file a report. What would I even say? I never got the gun back. I replaced it a few months later, but it wasn't the same. I still think about that man. How long had he been watching me? Was he there the first night? Was he the reason everything went quiet? More than anything, I think about how he stood there, perfectly still, like he knew I'd wake up, like he wanted me to see him. I haven't gone camping alone since then. Not once. I was 32 when I took that trip to the southeast of France. It was early September 2016, just after the school holidays ended. So most families had packed up and gone back to their routines. That left the campgrounds quiet, almost too quiet. I had flown in from Dublin with the plan to spend a couple of weeks driving through rural areas, camping out in national parks and forested regions. I wanted isolation. I wanted the silence of nature. I wanted to be alone. I rented a small Citroën from the Marseille airport and drove east for a few hours, eventually reaching a heavily wooded area near a town called Saint-Aubin. It wasn't a touristy place. The forests up there were thick with pine and oak, crisscrossed with narrow gravel roads that wound through steep hills and sharp valleys. I had done some research and marked out a few dispersed camping zones, places where you were technically allowed to set up a tent off-trail if you followed the rules and left no trace. By the time I got to the trailhead on the second afternoon of the trip, the sun had started to dip low behind the trees. The air had that golden, late summer stillness to it. I parked the car in a little gravel pullout by the edge of the forest, took my pack from the trunk, and locked up. I had about 2.5 hours of daylight left, and I figured that would be enough to hike in a few kilometers and find a spot near one of the small creeks that fed into the Verdon River. The trail was rough, barely marked, and overgrown in places. It didn't look like many people used it, and that was fine with me. I wanted solitude. My pack was heavy with gear, tent, food, water, my knife, sleeping pad, and a small hatchet. I liked to be prepared. I had my phone, too, fully charged, with an offline map of the area and a backup power bank, just in case. But there was no signal out there. None. Not even one bar. By the time I found a flat clearing near a cluster of moss-covered rocks, the sun was already gone behind the ridge, and the sky was dimming. I set up my tent quickly and gathered some kindling to start a fire. There was a soft breeze that picked up after dusk, rustling through the leaves and making the tree branches creak softly overhead. I remember thinking how peaceful it all was. The first night went by without anything strange happening. I cooked some instant noodles over my stove, read a bit by the firelight, and climbed into my sleeping bag around 10. It was cold that night, colder than I expected. I remember waking up at one point because the wind had picked up and something was tapping against the side of the tent. Probably a branch, I thought at the time. But when I unzipped the flap and looked outside with my flashlight, I didn't see anything. The trees were still, dead still, like they were holding their breath. I didn't think much of it. Wind plays tricks. The second day, I hiked around the area a bit, found the creek, and refilled my water bottles using my filter. I didn't see another soul. No other tents, no hikers, nothing. Just birds, bugs, and trees. I saw a couple of deer from a distance. Even though I liked the solitude, a part of me found the stillness strange. The forest didn't feel quite right. Not in a supernatural way, nothing like that, but just in a quiet, too empty way. You expect to see people out there in early September. Day hikers, hunters, someone. But it was just me. That evening, as the sun was going down and I was getting ready to boil water for dinner, I heard something that didn't sound like nature. It was subtle, like a low crack of a footstep on dry leaves, coming from the trees beyond my tent. I stood still. The forest was quiet. Then, another sound, closer this time, something shuffling. I held my breath and stepped away from the firelight, moving toward the edge of the trees with my flashlight off. I crouched low behind a rock, watching the shadows. For a long time, I didn't see anything, just darkness and the shapes of trees swaying slightly in the breeze. Then, finally, something moved. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but then I saw it clearly. It was a woman. She was standing about 20 meters from my campsite, half concealed behind a tree. She wasn't moving. just standing, staring. I couldn't make out her face, but she was tall and wearing something long, like a gray coat or robe. Her hair looked dark and stringy. I stayed completely still, not sure what to do. I wanted to call out, but something about her posture kept me silent. She wasn't acting like a lost hiker or someone who'd wandered too far. She wasn't carrying anything. She wasn't calling out or asking for help. She was just watching. I slowly backed away toward my tent, keeping my eyes on her. She didn't move. I turned on my flashlight and swept it across the trees, but by the time I brought it back to the spot she'd been standing, she was gone. I spent that night with my knife clutched in my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep much. Every small noise outside made me tense up. I kept telling myself she was probably a local, maybe homeless, maybe just strange. Maybe I had imagined it. But I knew what I saw. The way she stood there, it didn't feel right. In the morning, I packed up quickly. I didn't want to spend another night in that spot. I figured I'd hike back toward the car and find another camping area farther east, closer to the gorge. I started walking back along the trail, keeping my eyes open and moving fast. But after maybe 40 minutes of hiking, I realized I hadn't passed one of the rock markers I remembered from the hike in. I checked my offline map. I was slightly off course. Nothing crazy, but enough that I had to backtrack. That's when I saw her again. She was farther up the slope to my left, standing half in shadow behind a pine tree, just watching. Not close this time, maybe 30 or 40 meters up the hill. She didn't move. Her head tilted slightly, like she was trying to see me better through the trees. I didn't say anything. I didn't run. I just turned around and walked. Fast. I could feel her eyes on my back the whole time. That heavy, stomach-sick feeling settled in. I kept going until I hit the correct trail again and didn't stop until I saw the car. When I got there, I checked it thoroughly, doors, tires, under the body. Nothing out of place. I tossed my pack in the trunk and got in, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a few minutes, engine off, staring into the woods behind me, half expecting her to come out. But nothing moved. The forest looked completely normal. I started the car and drove back toward the nearest town, a little place called Castellane. It was about an hour away, and I got there around late afternoon. I booked a room in a small motel and stayed inside for the rest of the evening. I felt safer with walls around me, but I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. I should have stopped camping after that. I should have ended the trip and gone home, but I didn't. I thought maybe it was just a weird local, some eccentric person living out in the woods. Harmless. I convinced myself she wasn't following me, that it was just coincidence. I waited a day, then decided to camp again, this time near Lac de St. Croix. It was a busier area with more tourists and regular campgrounds. The first 2 nights there went by without any problems. Lots of other people around. I even heard other tents rustling at night, cars coming and going, dogs barking. It was a comfort, honestly. But then, the 3rd night, I had walked about a mile down one of the smaller trails near the lake, away from the campground, just to get some privacy and watch the sunset. I brought a small folding chair and my thermos. I sat by the water, watching the light fade behind the hills, letting myself relax for the first time in days. When I stood up to go back, I noticed something in the dirt trail behind me. Footprints. One set, bare feet. Long, narrow prints in the dry soil going the same direction I had come from. They weren't there earlier. I was sure of it. They looked fresh. I turned around, scanning the trees. I didn't see her, but I knew it was her. That feeling came back. Skin tingling, mouth dry, heart pushing up into my throat. I walked back fast, not running, but close. When I got back to my tent, everything looked normal. My stuff was untouched. No signs of anyone. I slept in my car that night. The next morning, I packed up everything and drove to Nice. I stayed in a hotel near the coast for the last 2 days of my trip. I didn't go near another forest. I didn't camp again. I didn't even go on a hike. I just sat on the beach, surrounded by people, trying to convince myself that nothing bad had happened, that no harm was done. But here's the thing. A week after I got home to Dublin, I noticed something strange. One of the photos on my phone, one I don't remember taking, showed a blurry image of the trail by the creek from that first campsite. And in the corner, barely visible between the trees, was a shape, a figure, wearing something long and gray. I deleted the picture. I deleted all the pictures from that trip. I've never gone camping alone since then. I still think about her sometimes, especially at night. I never saw her face clearly, but her presence is burned into my memory. The way she stood there, silent. The way she showed up more than once. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. She was real, and she was watching me. It was late October 2016, and I had just turned 32. I lived alone in Wichita, Kansas, and I had a job doing maintenance for a heating and cooling company. Most of my life was pretty repetitive. Wake up, go fix something, eat lunch in my truck, and head home in the evening. I didn't have a girlfriend at the time, didn't have a dog. My days off were usually spent watching sports or going out to eat by myself. It was the kind of life where nothing really happened. So when I got 2 days off in a row after a long string of work, I decided I wanted to go camping. I figured a night away from everything might help me clear my head. I didn't want a state park or campground. I wanted somewhere quiet, isolated, a place where I could light a fire, drink a few beers, and just sit in silence. I remembered this spot from when I was younger, out in the Flint Hills, a little over 2 hours from town. It wasn't anything official, just a stretch of public land where you could hike or set up a tent if you wanted. No running water, no marked trails. The kind of place that didn't show up on most maps. I'd only been there once before, with my older cousin when I was maybe 15. I remembered it being peaceful, with rolling hills and tall grass that moved like waves when the wind blew. There was a creek running through it, too, cold, shallow, and steady. I loaded up my truck that Friday morning with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, camping stove, cooler with some food and beer, flashlight, extra clothes. I also packed my Glock 19. I wasn't expecting trouble, but when you're camping alone in the middle of nowhere, it just feels better to have it. I threw it in my duffel bag, just in case. It was already gray and cloudy when I left Wichita around 10 a.m. The forecast said rain that evening, but I figured I could get there early enough to set up camp before it got bad. I wasn't planning on staying more than one night. The drive out was quiet. Once I got off the main highways and into the gravel roads, I didn't see another car, just open country and a lot of sky. The wind started picking up around noon. I pulled into the edge of the public land right before 1 o'clock. There wasn't a gate or anything, just a narrow dirt path that wound between the hills and disappeared behind some trees. I followed it for a while until it was too rough to keep driving. I parked my truck beside a patch of dead trees and started walking with my gear. It was colder than I thought it would be. My breath came out in little clouds. The tall grass was stiff and dry, but it crunched under my boots like broken glass. I found a decent spot about a 15-minute walk in, a small clearing next to a drop-off overlooking the creek. There was an old fire ring made of rocks, probably left by other campers. I liked it. You could see far in every direction, and there weren't any signs of other people around. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and had everything ready by around 3:30. The sky was darker now, and the wind had gotten sharp. It felt like something was creeping up behind the hills, like the weather was holding its breath. Around 5, it started to rain. Not heavy, just light and steady, like it was trying to decide if it wanted to get serious. I'd already gotten a fire going, and I sat under a tarp I'd rigged between a tree and a couple poles I brought. The flames hissed when the wind shifted and blew mist over them, but they held. I cracked open a beer and watched the fire dance. I sat like that for a long time, drinking and listening to the rain. It was peaceful, just the sounds of nature, wind in the grass, water dripping from the trees, the occasional snap from the fire. I wasn't thinking about work or bills or anything. I remember thinking it was probably the most relaxed I'd felt in months. Then, just after dark, maybe 7:30 or so, I heard something that didn't fit. It was faint at first, a low, steady crunching sound. I thought maybe it was just the wind dragging something through the grass, but it didn't stop. It had a pattern to it. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate ones, not an animal, too heavy, too even. I turned off my lantern and killed the fire with my boot and a jug of water. Everything went black except for the soft silver glow of the clouds above. I crouched behind my tent and listened. The steps were coming from the trees to the west, maybe 30 yards away. I didn't move, just listened. Then they stopped. Total silence. The rain tapped on the tarp and on the leaves, but everything else was still. I waited 5 minutes. Nothing. Then, without warning, I heard a single splash. Something stepped into the creek below me. That's when I got my gun. I unzipped the duffel bag as quietly as I could and pulled out the Glock. I hadn't fired it in months, but it was clean and loaded. I held it low and crouched again, eyes locked on the direction of the creek. I couldn't see much, but I knew someone was down there. Another splash, closer, then silence again. I waited like that for what felt like an hour. The rain got heavier. My clothes were wet, and my back hurt from crouching, but I didn't move. I felt exposed, vulnerable. My tent was a bright color, and the fire ring was obvious. Anyone coming through that area would have seen it, and I started thinking, why would someone be out here, alone, in the rain, after dark? It wasn't hunting season. This wasn't a popular hiking spot, and they weren't calling out, asking for help or trying to make noise. They were quiet, sneaky. Around 9:30, I finally heard footsteps again, this time from behind me. I spun around, gun up, heart pounding in my ears. Nothing was there, just grass and shadows, but I was sure of it. Someone had circled around me. I backed up to a tree and tried to stay as still as possible. I didn't want to shoot anyone unless I had to, but I also wasn't going to let someone sneak up on me. Then I saw it, just for a second, a dark shape moving between the trees about 50 feet away. Tall, human-shaped.
No flashlight, no gear.
Just a figure moving low and slow, like they were trying to stay hidden. I didn't call out. I just watched. Then it disappeared behind a boulder. I didn't sleep that night, not a second. I stayed crouched behind that tree with my gun in my hand, soaked to the bone, shivering from the cold and adrenaline. The rain kept falling. Sometimes I thought I heard breathing. Sometimes I didn't hear anything at all, and that was worse. At some point, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning, the rain let up and a low fog rolled through the hills. It made everything feel like a dream, but I knew what I saw. I stayed alert, eyes darting to every sound. I didn't dare move. Then, just before dawn, I saw something at the edge of the clearing. Pair of eyes. Not glowing, not animal eyes, just the faint glint of light off human eyes. Low to the ground, unmoving. I raised my gun. I didn't shoot. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just watched me. Then they were gone. Just like that. By the time the sun started coming up, I was a wreck. Every muscle ached. My hands were shaking. I kept looking around, expecting the figure to come rushing out from the fog, but nothing did. I waited until full daylight before I packed up. Fast. I didn't even fold my tent. I just stuffed it into the truck bed. I left the tarp, the poles, even the cooler. I didn't care. I just wanted out of there. When I finally got back to the truck and drove off, I didn't look back. The dirt road was slick with mud, and my tires spun a few times, but I didn't stop. I got back to the highway and didn't breathe easy until I saw other cars. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time. What was I going to say? Some guy watched me in the dark all night? Who would believe that? And what would it change? But I know what I saw. Someone was out there, watching me, circling my camp. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe they were just passing through. Maybe they thought I was someone else. Or maybe they were waiting for me to fall asleep. I never found out. But I never camped alone again. Not once. And to this day, whenever it rains at night and I hear the wind against my window, I think about that figure in the dark, standing silently in the wet grass, waiting. I was 31 when I made the decision to camp alone in a small overgrown graveyard on the outskirts of an old mining town in northern Idaho. It was the summer of 2019, and I had been living in Spokane, Washington for a few years, working as a freelance graphic designer. The flexibility of my job let me take small trips whenever I wanted. I was going through a phase where I craved solitude, real quiet, and raw nature, so I started doing short weekend solo camping trips in remote places. I'd been reading a forum where people talked about strange, offbeat locations to camp. Someone mentioned this forgotten cemetery near a dried-up creek bed west of Wallace, Idaho. It was an old miner burial site, long since abandoned. No maintenance, no fencing, no tourists, just rusted iron crosses, half-collapsed wooden markers, and wild brush reclaiming everything. A photo showed a few small markers half swallowed by weeds, with thick pine trees in the background. It looked grim and quiet. I felt drawn to it. I packed up my Jeep Friday afternoon, tent, tarp, sleeping bag, a small camping stove, a lantern, knife, compass, bear spray, and 2 gallons of water. I threw in an old .22 rifle, not because I expected to use it, but because being alone in the woods felt easier with it nearby. I left around 3 p.m. and arrived in Wallace just before sunset. From there, I followed a dirt road marked only with a weathered Forest Service sign. No name, no number. I drove about 5 miles into the forest, then took a narrow path off the main road that led deeper into the trees. I had the GPS coordinates from the forum, but they weren't precise. I relied on my printed topo map and dead reckoning to find it. The final mile I had to walk. The trail was barely visible. Thick underbrush slowed me down. I had to use a stick to knock aside spiderwebs strung between trunks. It smelled like pine needles and old wet earth. The forest was dense, the air still. There were no birds. It got dark fast. I had a headlamp, but I didn't use it until the last half hour. I finally spotted a few leaning wooden grave markers through the trees, almost like a shadow of a graveyard. No fence, no sign, just a slight clearing with maybe 30 markers scattered unevenly in the brush, many of them rotting or tipped over. The ground was soft in places, more moss than grass. I set up my tent in a flat spot on the outer edge, away from the center of the graves. I didn't want to walk all over them. There was no moon that night. I cooked a quick meal, rice and beans, ate by lantern light and sipped a beer. The silence was absolute. Even insects seemed to stay away. I felt alert, a little jumpy. I told myself it was just the isolation. After cleaning up, I climbed into my sleeping bag around 10:30 p.m. and turned off the lantern. The first few hours were uneventful. I lay awake a while, listening to every small sound. The forest creaked occasionally. A distant owl hooted, but it was nothing unusual. I dozed off sometime around midnight. I woke up an hour or two later, suddenly and completely. No noise had startled me. My heart was pounding. My body felt tight. I just woke up. I lay perfectly still and listened. The tent fabric rustled softly from the breeze, but I felt something, an unease I couldn't explain. Then I heard a sound from outside. It was soft, crackling, a twig breaking, then another. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving in the brush just a few feet away. I lay completely still, my ears straining. My first thought was a deer, maybe an elk, maybe even a bear. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The steps were too slow to be an animal. They had rhythm, left, right, pause. Then again. I slowly reached for my knife and then my headlamp. I didn't turn it on. I just waited, holding my breath. The steps got closer. I heard them circle around the tent, moving along the edge of the clearing. Whoever it was, or whatever it was, wasn't trying to be quiet, but wasn't making a lot of noise either. Just moving, then stopping, then moving again. It didn't speak. It didn't make any loud movements. Just that slow stepping and pausing. I thought about yelling, but something in me didn't want to let whoever was out there know I was awake. I reached for the bear spray with my other hand and waited. My fingers were slick with sweat. I couldn't see anything through the tent fabric, just shadows. The moon was hidden by clouds. I heard another branch snap. It was closer, too close, then silence. Nothing for a long time. 10 minutes, then 20. I lost track. My body ached from staying still. I didn't know if it was still out there. Eventually, I turned on the headlamp inside the tent. The bright light felt like a small comfort. I waited, still nothing. After a long while, I unzipped the flap just an inch and peeked out. The light from the lamp spilled onto the grass, but it didn't reach far. I couldn't see anything moving. I stepped out carefully, holding the bear spray. The clearing looked untouched. The grave markers leaned like before. The wind was still. I circled the tent, checking the brush. No footprints, no broken twigs, nothing out of place. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting upright in the tent with the light on. No more footsteps came. I didn't sleep again. The first light, I packed up. I didn't eat breakfast. I felt like something had watched me all night and just melted away at dawn. I walked the mile back to my Jeep fast, checking over my shoulder constantly. When I got to the car, I loaded everything and drove back toward Wallace without stopping. I didn't report anything. There wasn't anything to report. No crime, no proof, just footsteps. Weeks went by and I kept thinking about it. Couldn't shake it. So I went back online and searched the forum again. I looked through all the old threads. Someone else had commented on the graveyard spot. He mentioned going there alone once in 2015 and hearing someone walking around his tent around 1 a.m. He left before dawn and never went back. A different user said he found an old campsite in that area once with gear still there. Tent collapsed, food rotted, but no sign of anyone. That post was from 2017. It made me think of who else had been there, and why someone might have been walking through a forgotten cemetery in the middle of nowhere, long after dark. There were no houses, no trails, no reason for anyone to be nearby. Not unless they lived off-grid, or were watching people who came through. I've done solo trips since then, but I don't go back to Idaho. I never camp near cemeteries anymore, either. Even in daylight, I keep my guard up. Because the thing that scared me most wasn't what I saw, it was what I didn't. Whoever was out there that night stayed hidden. Quiet, close, maybe just watching, maybe waiting. And that's worse than anything I could imagine.